Hello and welcome back to Bookish Theories. In today's video, I would like to talk about ENHYPEN's Fever, focusing on a little breakdown and analysis of the lyrics, the music video, and its connections to the storyline. Fever is a song that explores the overwhelming emotions of a person who is overcome by passion and cannot get away from it despite their attempt at breaking free from this desire. Now in the song, this longing is obviously compared to a fever that blends their judgment and takes over their body and mind, and right off the bat, this metaphor is very fitting because the love that ENHYPEN are singing about is both something that infects them and something that alters their senses in a way that they never experienced before. As we'll see in a second, this is a love that is both dangerous and seductive. They know that they shouldn't give in to it, and yet they do. They know that this passion will destroy them, but they keep wanting more. And these contrasting feelings are meant to continue exploring the carnival concept that was first introduced back in Intro the Invitation. You see, in the context of the storyline, Intro the Invitation, Drunk-Dazed, and Fever draw a very clear narrative that shows us their journey towards temptation that culminates into their ultimate downfall. If in Border Day 1 the boys explored their experience in crossing a line that essentially allowed their dreams to come true, Border Carnival focuses on the confusion and excitement that they feel in entering a reality where everything is flipped upside down and life is mixed with death. In Intro the Invitation, for instance, the boys told us that they were attracted by a flicker that blinds and deceives and that they crossed the border because of that. This is a signal that was supposedly sent by the woman that we see in Drunk-Dazed and that possibly represents the dark moon that is mentioned in ENHYPEN's storyline. This is an entity that lures them in with the promise of taking everything they ever wanted, but that ends up corrupting them with temptation. So even if the boys eventually get what they want, their desire also comes with a price. Bear in mind, ENHYPEN's concept is all about giving and taking, so in order to achieve immortality by becoming vampires, they first have to give up their mortal life and the innocence that it entails. Now in Drunk-Dazed, this transition was conveyed by showing the boys celebrating their bloody birthday and getting intoxicated by the overwhelming feeling that this transformation implies, and in many respects we can say that Fever continues to explore this concept by focusing on the physical reaction that this change actually causes. As we see at the beginning, for instance, this fever is essentially caused by darkness taking over. Much like what we saw in Intro the Invitation, when the boys cross the border and arrive to the castle, the Feast of Light turns into a festival of blood, so even if at first the days makes them feel like in paradise, soon enough the fever overpowers them and their thirst for blood drives them into a frenzy. Now back in Drunk-Dazed, the seduction that the boys experience in the story was actually foreshadowed with a subtle reference to Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered. This is a song by Ella Fitzgerald that talked about a woman being overpowered by a destructive love that makes her want to do anything for the man that she loves. In that song, the lyrics told us that even if the man was cold and essentially had her wrapped around his finger, the woman was literally bewitched, bothered, and bewildered by him, and the very same thing can be said for ENHYPEN as well. Much like what the lyrics imply, the boys are powerless in front of the entity that seduces them, and this enchantment begins when they're standing in front of her throne and she gives her blood in order to transform them. This is what triggers their transition into vampires and what causes the fever that is driving them insane, and in the video this experience is actually portrayed in different ways. We see Isung portraying the more elusive aspect of this desire while he is in the bedroom, Nikki putting his face in the water to cool himself down, the boys wandering in the castle in a daze, and Jay trying to lower his temperature by having a shower. But no matter what side effects the boys might be having, what we know for sure is that it all started with the black smoke that is hunting them down. At the beginning, we see all of them running towards the light, and when they stop, they look up like they did when they were in front of the woman in white. Much like Drunk-Dazed told us, that is the light that they received. It's the flames of the torch that brightens the darkness and that they have to learn to master over time, but much like what the song foreshadowed, this light also ends up burning their heart and reveals the pitiful truth behind their mask, which is none other than the vampire coming to the surface. As we see the boys trying to run away from this sudden change, we also see Hisung being trapped in a room while he is overpowered by the black smoke, and even if for now we still don't know why he's being singled out, he also seems to call out to Jake before saying something else and eventually disappearing in the darkness. Now this is possibly a part of the storyline that is yet to be revealed, but if Hisung is indeed calling Jake, this might imply that Jake has a specific role in the story which we still don't know much about. What I can tell you, however, is that to a certain extent, Jake seems to be a bit different in comparison to the others, because if in the hype version the other members were portrayed in a red light, Jake was the only one that we saw in a blue light. Back in DRUNK-DAZED, on the other hand, we also saw that when Jake was upside down, he dropped the blood instead of drinking it, and Fever also shows us that when the boys are awakening from their metaphorical sleep by removing their hand from their eyes, Jake was the only one who actually had another member doing it for him. Jungwon was already awake, and he removes his hand from Jake's face to make him see this new world, so these visuals might imply that if the others fall naturally into temptation, Jake might be the one that is more hesitant to do so. Another detail that makes me think that this could be the case, moreover, is the scene where Jake and Sonu are separated by the wall. In the behind the scenes, Jake said that that moment was all about him trying to talk to Sonu through the wall and Sonu being unable to hear him, so as we see him leaving into the darkness, Jake had to look desperate because Sonu couldn't listen to what he was trying to say. Now, if we consider the role that Sonu had in DRUNK-DAZED, it's entirely possible that this scene might be a reference to Sonu being lured in to cross the border and Jake being desperate because of that. As we see in the videos, all of them end up crossing the line and becoming vampires, but this doesn't necessarily mean that all of them do it on their own accord, and this idea might actually be very fitting in Sunghoon's case as well. Now, if back in DRUNK-DAZED we saw Sunghoon dancing in a rain of blood, this time around we see him being hypnotized by Nikki with a necklace that he ends up receiving with his mouth, and as we see in a second, I think that these two scenes are actually showing us the very same process taking place. You see, back in my DRUNK-DAZED video, I actually said that the bloody rain could have been a reference to the Rain of Fate's arrows that was mentioned in Given and Taken. Back then, Sunghoon's fate was written in blood, so the rain that overcomes him can essentially be seen as his fate coming to life as he's being hit by metaphorical arrows of blood. As we saw in both Given and Taken and DRUNK-DAZED, however, this is a process that the boys themselves have started, because if in the debut we saw them shooting the arrows of fate, in the comeback we saw Sonu putting his blood into the fountain that ends up overflowing in Sunghoon's room. This might be an indication that the thirst for blood that causes the fever is something that was first given to them by the woman, but also something that they pass on to each other until all of them become vampires, and fever actually reinforces this idea as well. Much like in Given and Taken, where Nikki and Sunghoon were paired up when they talked about the red blood in the crown, Fever shows us Nikki essentially infecting Sunghoon by putting him in a daze and feeding him the source of this daze until it traps his heart completely. As it was revealed in the behind the scenes, this is a process that is eventually completed by Hee-sung, who puts his hand on Sunghoon's chest and passes him the fever that chains him once and for all. If you look closely, however, even if Sunghoon's heart is trapped by the fever, this fever also brightens it with the very same light that they received by the flames of the torch. As the lyrics tell us, when the boys cross the border and the light burns them, the dark moon essentially becomes their new sun, and this is yet another reference to Given and Taken, where the song tells us that they dive into the red sun even if its light burns them and blinds them. Now, these references actually tell us that Given and Taken, DRUNK-DAZED and Fever are basically portraying the same process of them turning into vampires and experiencing the ups and downs of this transformation. When they cross the border, they reach a reality where life and death are mixed together. The boys die so the vampires can be born, and the light that they receive is both what blinds them and burns them, but also the very thing that keeps them alive in this new stage of their existence. So to a certain extent, we can say the fever is them adjusting to this transition in the wake of the most important transformation of their life. Now, if you watch my videos in the past, then you know that ENHYPEN's concept is also explained with a lot of callbacks to some poems by William Shakespeare, and these callbacks essentially tell us the story of a boy's journey towards the immortality of the soul who is tempted by a dark lady who causes his downfall. These references started all the way back in Intro Walk the Line, continued in Given and Taken, in Outro Cross the Line, and can also be found in Intro The Invitation. And as it turns out, Fever is no different, because the song actually references Sonnet 147. In the sonnet, the poet describes the moment where he is tempted by the dark lady, and he compares his love to a fever that makes him long for the very thing that nurses the disease. Much like in the song, where the boys tell us that their heart is thirsty because of this passion, the poem compares this love to a sickly appetite that the man needs to please. In the sonnet, Reason is a doctor that left him to deal with his illness by himself, and even if the poet knows that this passion is driving him insane, he's also well aware that he cannot be cured from this disease, so he ends up accepting it because desire is death. Now, Shakespeare comparing desire to death here is actually very fitting for ENHYPEN's concept, because the passion that led them to cross the border is also what led to the death of the human. As I mentioned earlier, for the vampire to be born, the boy has to die, and much like in the poem, this death is caused by the desire that infected them with the fever. In this carnival where everything is flipped upside down, a new life is given only when their old life is taken, but if we follow the poem, this transition also comes with a sudden revelation about the woman that caused this downfall. You see, in the poem, Shakespeare says that even if at first he thought that the Dark Lady was fair and bright, the fever made him realize that she's actually black as hell and dark as night, meaning that the pain that she causes him makes him realize the true nature of this woman. Now, something similar actually takes place in ENHYPEN's storyline as well, because much like in the poem, the boys are attracted by her light only to be overcome by darkness as a result. In both cases, moreover, this realization doesn't change the final outcome of their destiny, because even if they now know that this woman tempted them, their illness has spread to the point that they can no longer escape it. Now, this concept is also conveyed in Sonnet 148, which is the one that comes right after the fever one and that was fittingly referenced in Given and Taken. In that sonnet, Shakespeare says that love has blinded its judgment with lust, and the boys reference this poem when they talk about the red sun that blinds them and burns them, so as you can see, it's so slowly coming together. In Intro the Invitation, for instance, the boys reference the sonnet that comes before the fever, where the boy in the poem is actually looking for ways to make his soul become eternal. In order to free himself from the vanity of the rebel powers, that is, the vanity of the body, the boy sells hours of draws in exchange for divine time. But in the story, this process gets twisted because the immortality that the dark moon gives them is a type of immortality that comes from temptation rather than divinity. This is a realization that eventually hits them in Fever, where the boys reference the poem that comes right after. Much like in the sonnet, the boys realize that they've been tricked but can no longer escape the enchantment of the temptress, so in Given and Taken they reference the sonnet where the poet says that he's been blinded by love and now has to pay the price for this blindness. Much like the protagonist of the poems, ENHYPEN have been tricked by a light that ended up luring them into the darkness, but this is just the beginning of their journey because, as the outro says, the curse of the dark moon will give them access to multiple dimensions. To know how this will play out, however, we'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please think about liking and subscribing. As always, thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye bye!